It's a pleasure today for me to introduce Dr. Mike Parker to you. Mike is a faculty member in our zoology and physiology department. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and both a master's and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. His principal area of research emphasis has been in lake environments in the past, where he's worked on nutrient dynamics, nutrient uptake by phytoplankton, reproductive strategies in aquatic macrophytes, and a variety of other topics. Recently, he's also become interested and involved in the utilization of microcomputer techniques in assessing and understanding environmental problems of a variety of sorts. Today, Mike is going to be speaking to us on a topic somewhat unrelated to either of those areas of activity and expertise, although it does parallel the lake work, certainly. And the title of his talk is entitled Streams, Riparian Zones, and Water Quality. So welcome to Water Talk, Mike.
Thank you. If we can have the lights, did somebody just switch on the slides there? I always feel a bit awkward in giving a talk like this because although I'm up here speaking, what I'm talking about really is work that's been performed by a variety of people. Here we see some off-campus and on-campus people that have been involved. Thompson and Greb from Western Wyoming, Cliff Dahm, University of New Mexico, Apple, Stabler, Butler, Voigt, Smith are or were Bureau of Reclamation, and Elder and Payne and Skinner are from the university, Klempt over in range management. Some other people from zoology that have been involved, graduate students, Tim Merritt, Tim Fannin, Fred Wood, Dave Gully, and Carol Brewer. In addition to a variety of people being involved in this work, it turns out there have been a variety of institutions. The Water Center provided some monies for part of what we'll be talking about today, but also DEQ, the U.S. EPA, the Bureau of Reclamation and Land Management have been involved in one way or another. Owners of the Current Creek Ranch, and most of the chemical analyses about which I'll be talking today were performed at the Water Quality Lab at Western Wyoming Community College. Now to begin, to set the scene, let me back up. What I'll do is begin by sort of setting the scene, go on to talk some about beaver and erosion, and third and fourth, talk about beaver and water quality. And to begin with, I'd like to read from, let's see, this is from Gin's 1949 version of the Sixth Form Reader. I'm assuming that must be sixth grade. Sam Davis sat his horse and looked over the backs of the cattle to the mountains looming in the distance. "We'll have to be driving up to the hills pretty soon," he said to the boy who had stopped his pony beside Sam's pinto. "Yeah," replied Johnny Allen, whose father owned the Bar Circle Ranch. "Here it is, only the last of June, and the creek's almost dry. Can't graze cattle without water." "Seems to me the creek dries up earlier and earlier each year," said Sam, crossing one skinny knee over his saddle horn. He was the ranch foreman and been a close friend of Johnny since the latter's birth on this same ranch 12 years ago. "Wonder where all the water goes to," said Johnny. "There was enough of it this last spring. It runs off," answered Sam, squinting his blue eyes up to the blue Colorado sky, as if he might find there the source of his troubles. "But it didn't used to," he added. "I can remember when this stream ran all summer long, clear and full." "Honest?" said Johnny. Sam nodded and snapped a fly off his knee. "That's right. But that was when there used to be lots of beaver in these hills. Their dams held back water in the ponds, and it fed out of them into this creek gradual-like, so it ran all summer." Well, think about, from your own experience, a stream with a lot of beaver activity. Perhaps 15, 20 beaver ponds per mile on that stream. In your imagination, compare that stream to another stream, or perhaps even what that same stream would be like without the beaver. You have to be struck by the dramatic difference. In fact, people have made estimates of the number of beaver that must have been present prior to Europeans' presence in North America. And the estimates are anywhere from 6 to 24 beaver on every mile of every stream and river in North America. 6 to 24 beaver on every mile of every stream. So I suppose one hypothesis, or my first hypothesis today, would be that removal of beaver was the greatest perturbation to smaller lotic systems that has been made by European or by Western man. Now a word about how I got interested in what I'll be talking about today. We were doing some work over by Flaming Gorge. I was driving up a drainage and came to a point where the valley floor was fairly level, and off to the edge of the valley was an old log house, long abandoned. And as I drove by, I thought, I wonder why they built that place here. And it sort of looks over this sagebrush flat. Well, I stopped and I got out and I wandered into the river valley, or to the floodplain, the valley, and almost fell into a gash about 20 or 30 feet deep. A stream ran through, or runs through, the valley bottom and had eroded 20 or 30 feet straight down. So why did they build there originally? Well, probably originally that was a stream right up at the surface of the land, or near the surface of the land, and it was, at least in part, a fairly lush meadow, and that was why the ranch house was built there. This log cabin was built there. Why did that erosion occur? Well, the power, we're simplifying here a little bit, but bear with me. Power of water to erode is a function of velocity, and in turn, velocity is a function of discharge. Okay, here we're looking at a simplified diagram of factors affecting discharge, and at the bottom is indicated that much discharge, for example floods, should lead to erosion. On the right are listed two factors commonly considered important, probably, in affecting erosion or aggradation: climate, and secondly, herbivory or grazing. On the left are two less commonly discussed factors: man's regulation of fire, and secondly, beaver, or more specifically, beaver dams. The significance of beaver dams perhaps is a bit more clear if we think of them as continually renewed, erosionally resistant substrates. In that context, it makes sense that they might have some effect on erosion. Back to the log house by the badly downcut stream, what happened? Well, let's assume that the rancher wanted to run a few more animals and be better able to support his family. The scenario might have been that in this area there were beaver, and quite likely the beaver dams made the meadow marshy, and perhaps cattle couldn't gain access to the vegetation. Well, the solution to that problem is simply remove the dams and the beaver, and things will dry up, and the cattle or the whatever will gain access to the vegetation. Secondly, might want to increase production of hay as a way to support more animals. Back then, the way that would have been done would be by flood irrigation. And if you ever talk to any of the old ranchers, or even some today, you know that beaver are real pests. They get into the irrigation dishes and dam them up. Solution to that problem, get rid of the beaver. Well, let's say it's the 10-year or 25-year flood that does most erosional damage, most erosional down cutting. If we remove beaver, 5 years passes, not much happens. 10, 50, 25 years comes by, get a real gully washer, and erosion begins. After another 50 or 75 years, we really begin to notice there's a problem in terms of erosion. But it's not until 50, 75, 100 years after the cause, in this case, simple scenario, being the removal of beaver, it's not until 50 to 75 or 100 years after that that we truly begin to be frightened of the consequences of our action. Today, as in the story about Johnny from Jin's Reader, People are beginning to think about reintroducing beaver as a way to manage riparian systems. For example, though I'm fuzzy about the details, I think there's an association of people, I'm not sure if it's growers or an irrigation association in Idaho that are actively using this as a tactic. This is a strategy not without problems, however. For example, beavers do dam flowing water, culverts, irrigation ditches. As well, they're carriers for Giardia. So, and as you probably know, Giardia can cause pretty horrible intestinal problems and even death. So there are some public health considerations as well. But with this general background, let's go on to consider why beaver and their dams can be so important when considering erosion in lower order or in smaller streams. And we might hypothesize that historical and erosional downcutting in at least some lower order riparian systems was caused by removal of beaver. Think now about these three questions. Are they true or are they false? Streams and their drainage basins exist in a state of equilibrium. Water moves downhill and entropy increases. True or false? Well, streams and their drainage basins exist in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Well, probably most of us would agree to that statement's true, especially if we're given a chance to define some terms and or perhaps provide an explanation to or and a qualifier. Literally, the next two are false. Water moves downhill, entropy increases. For example, water can be pumped uphill. You can pump water uphill. And you are an organism, and organisms exemplify localized systems which remain exceedingly organized through time. Entropy does not increase. Okay, what's common about water moving uphill and entropy not increasing, these two simple examples, is that the statements are literally false only if there is some way we can put energy into the system to resist what would otherwise occur. We burn gasoline to run a pump and pump the water uphill. You eat a steak, metabolize, and you use that energy, or you metabolize the energy, chemical energy available, and you use that for metabolism and growth, maintenance and growth. Now we can relate these ideas to riparian system. Oh dear. Let's see. You can relate these ideas to riparian systems by the second hypothesis on the screen here. That activities of beaver can provide resistance to perturbations of the dynamic equilibrium if the perturbation is not too great. Okay, the thermodynamic basis for this hypothesis then is that energy to resist a shift in equilibrium is provided by the activity of beaver. The beaver dam itself, which we can think of again as a continually renewed, erosionally resistant substrate, would be the mechanistic basis for our hypothesis. The problem is, of course, that we need to quantify resistance to perturbation, and if we can't do that, we can't decide whether or not a particular perturbation, for example, would be too great or not. What do we mean by that? We'll recall that the ability of water to erode, being again simplistic, in other words, to destroy a beaver dam, is a function of velocity, and that at any one point in the stream, velocity is going to be, at least in part, a function of discharge. At the top of this screen are illustrated three streams in cross-section. A and B somewhat entrenched, and stream C has a rather broad floodplain. At the bottom is another figure with a depiction of how velocity, and hence the power to erode, will vary as discharge increases. For example, the curve labeled 3 shows us that with a relatively wide, flat floodplain, velocity increases very gradually because depth increases very gradually as discharge increases. The curve labeled 1 in the bottom graph would be a situation where depth increases rapidly as discharge increases. Now this slide also illustrates a relation between discharge and velocity and shows how we can quantify the ability of a beaver dam to resist perturbations to the system which may alter discharge. Okay, on the x-axis, the point labeled A represents the discharge of, say, currently a 10 or a 20-year flood, peak discharge that we would agree is a discharge that could do real erosional damage. On the y-axis, at the point labeled V sub W, which would be the velocity causing washout velocity. Okay, that point on the y-axis represents the velocity at which the bank or the beaver dam bank complex would fail. In other words, where washout would occur. So on the slide, the stippled area represents an area of velocity or discharge above which the beaver dam cannot persist or cannot prevail. So to the distance then on the x-axis between the point labeled A and the point where the stippled region begins, quantifies the ability of a beaver dam to resist an increase in discharge, quantifies the ability to resist a perturbation which will increase discharge. And note that we can, or the units of this measure would simply be those of volume discharge. Vegetation can affect the relation that we've talked about in a couple of ways. Vegetation with vertical structures, such as willow thickets, will reduce velocity and will therefore increase this washout threshold by reducing the power of water to erode, by reducing velocity. Vegetation with little vertical structure, grass, for example, is not going to affect velocity very much, but it will increase the washout threshold by requiring a greater velocity before erosion can begin, before substrate particles can begin to be picked up. So we can quantify the ability of beaver dams to resist erosion owing to increased discharge in units of discharge, and this ability will simply be the distance between point A on the x-axis, point A being sort of the current peak erosional event, and the area or the point on the y-axis where the stippling begins. That is, it's going to be the ability to resist a perturbation will be the difference between the present value of discharge during some peak flood and that which may occur owing to the change or the perturbation. I had a slide out of order. The point to be made from that slide was summarizing some points that we've already made. One that I haven't mentioned is that owing to dams, there's an increase in water storage, which in turn should increase minimum flows late in summer. There's an interesting anecdotal account of this effect in a book entitled Three Against the Wilderness. It's an autobiography of a fellow who lived in British Columbia. It starts with him as a young fellow at a trading post, working at a trading post out in the boonies. And this is an area where beaver had been extirpated, completely removed years prior, so there were no beaver in this area. He's working at the trading post, and an Indian girl and her grandmother come to the post. He's very attracted to the Indian girl, and the grandmother sees this, kind of takes him aside and lectures him that he should marry the girl, that he should bring back the beaver, and if he does this, he will live happily ever after. Well, a couple of days later, the grandmother dies, but he does take her advice. He marries the girl, and eventually reintroduces beaver into the portion of the land that he's homesteading. And one consequence of that is, in fact, increased low flows or minimum flows during late summer and fall. The last point on the slide that was out of order was to suggest that beaver dams improve water quality, and that's the next topic. And let's talk about the effect of beaver ponds on the non-point source water quality of a stream in southwest Wyoming, in particular Current Creek. Current Creek is a tributary to Flaming Gorge. Here we have the drainage basin of Flaming Gorge on the slide, with Flaming Gorge being the white area right at the very bottom middle of the slide. Current Creek is the drainage indicated as number 6 on the slide. The upper portion of the dam, or upper portion of the drainage, doesn't have any beaver dams. Then there's a middle section of the Current Creek drainage where there's a fairly extensive area of a complex of beaver dams and beaver ponds. And then below this complex of beaver ponds, there's another stretch without beaver, and finally the creek runs into Flaming Gorge. We collected data in the area above the complex of beaver ponds, in the area that had the beaver pond complex, and then below the complex of beaver ponds. And we were interested in the hypothesis that the presence of these beaver ponds, or this dam complex, would improve water quality. And in particular, we measured suspended solids, several forms of phosphorus, total phosphorus and orthophosphorus, and NaOH extractable phosphorus, which is some people suggest as a good index of that phosphorus which is biologically available for use by algae, for example. And then finally a couple of forms of nitrogen, total Kjeldahl nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen. From measures of flow and concentration, we were able to estimate whether on an annual basis lesser amounts of these parameters were exported from the area with the beaver dams, or the complex of ponds, then flowed into this area from upstream. And as indicated on the slide, the pond complex did appear to retain some of these parameters. Retention was 50 to 75% for suspended solids, 20 to 65% for total phosphorus and TKN, and 20 to 25% for nitrate nitrogen. But it turns out that because the dam complex is in the middle of this particular drainage, and because there's bank erosion and some downcutting between the ponds and Flaming Gorge itself, that the export of suspended solids, total phosphorus, and other nutrients, the export of these to Flaming Gorge, the reservoir downstream, was not reduced. On this slide, the height of the surface represents, in this case, the concentration of total phosphorus. The axis here represents distance along the creek, and we go from upstream above the beaver dam complexes to the area where the dams occur, and then down below the beaver dams. And this axis represents time. Earlier, looking at spring runoff, on into summer and early fall. First of all, note the importance of high flow during spring runoff in causing higher concentrations of total phosphorus. That statement's backwards. What you're seeing here are concentrations of total phosphorus. I'm suggesting to you that an inference that can be made is those concentrations are owing to high runoff, erosional input, primarily particulate phosphorus, but some soluble phosphorus. Notice that as we go from the back of the slide to the front, from early in the spring to summer, fall, concentrations decrease dramatically when we begin to encounter lower flows. Secondly, note that below the dam complex, concentrations increase pretty quickly, i.e., if we look particularly at the back of the slide earlier in the year, there's a valley in between, and what we see is lots of phosphorus going into the area with the dams, it's being removed, we don't find much, but then below the dams, very quickly, amounts of concentrations of phosphorus increase once again. We conclude, or concluded, that the complex of beaver dams can improve, in fact, improve the quality of water flowing through them. So we would reject the null hypothesis that beaver dams have no effect on water quality. Let's next turn to another aspect of water quality, and what we'll talk about now is just a small portion of a much more detailed analysis than I'll discuss today. But I was interested in biologically available phosphorus, and first some background. If we're interested in the effects of nutrients on waters, lakes and streams, I at least am interested in the biological effects of these nutrients. What do these nutrients do to the standing crop of algae, zooplankton? Do they have any effect on fish through other aspects of water quality? Well, if I'm interested in biological responses of the receiving waters, or biological responses, nuisance blooms, then the best measure will be some kind of biological measure, a measure of, in fact, algal biomass or algal growth. Well, it turns out that such bioassays are very time-consuming and expensive, and in fact, practically often they're just not practical to use. They're too costly, too expensive. The next best alternative to some sort of biological measure, some kind of bioassays, would be a chemical analysis which measures the amount or the concentration of phosphorus or some other nutrient of interest. Well, it turns out that if we are talking about phosphorus, many of the common, well, I guess they're not limnological techniques, but many of the common techniques for measuring phosphorus don't correlate well with data from bioassays. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Well, recently, some workers have suggested that a form of phosphorus called sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus, the concentrations of sodium, or that, workers have suggested that the concentrations of sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus do correlate well with data from bioassays, and that therefore this sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus may be a very good index of, maybe a very good index of that phosphorus which is biologically available. I had data, or had available data from about analyses on from 8 sites over 3 years, and a total of about 400 analyses from each site of the sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus, and a variety of other parameters as well. I wished to determine whether one can accurately predict this NaOHP, sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus, from data on suspended solids and orthophosphate. 2 reasons for choosing those parameters. When people have looked at biologically available phosphorus, explicitly done some research, they found that something that surprised me, and that was that some of the phosphorus that that normal techniques would consider to be particulate phosphorus, in fact, are biologically available. Okay. Other portions of what the plants use are dissolved, are soluble. So my reasoning was I would choose something that would index, I hoped, the amount of soluble biologically available phosphorus, and that would be via orthophosphate. And secondly, suspended solids being an index of the total amount of suspended solids. So what I wish to do is to determine whether I could accurately predict this NaOHP from data on suspended solids and orthophosphorus. Now, there are a couple of reasons for wanting to do this. Turns out this NaOHP extraction is a fairly recent technique, and there really aren't very many historical data at all. You can't go back in the literature and find any information on the NaOHP. But there are lots of historical data on orthophosphate and on suspended solids and on the consequences or effects, biological effects, of eutrophication, enrichment owing to phosphorus. So I reasoned if we could predict NaOHP from orthophosphate and suspended solids, then we might be able to use these historical data sets as a way to test the idea or to test the hypothesis that measuring NaOHP provides the best way, or measuring NaOHP and hence indexing biologically available phosphorus will give us better estimates of the effects of enrichment by phosphorus than would data, say, on orthophosphate, for example. In other words, we know what happened in the past. Will explanations about what happened be better using data from on NaOHP than other measures of phosphorus? Secondly, it turns out that although measuring this NaOHP is in fact cheaper than performing bioassays, it's still not real cheap, and it's probably more costly than the expense required to measure orthophosphate and suspended solids. And orthophosphorus and suspended solids are fairly commonly measured as water quality parameters. So if we can in fact predict NaOHP, and if in fact that is a good index of biologically available phosphorus, so if we can predict NaOHP from these more cheaply measured suspended solids and orthophosphate, then perhaps we can cheaply gain access to a fair amount of information that would be pretty useful for predicting the biological effects of enrichment by phosphorus. This slide again shows the drainage basin of Flaming Gorge, and the 8 numbered locations are those sites where data were collected for this whole series of parameters, including suspended solids, orthophosphate, and NaOHP. There were, as I said, there were about 400 sampling trips that were made to these 8 sites over a period of 3 years. My approach to deciding whether we can predict NaOHP from suspended solids and ortho-P was statistical. I used regression analysis with indicator variables and also some other techniques as well. This slide lists the independent variables that were considered in developing regressions. LSS is simply the log of suspended solids. LOP is the log of orthophosphate. L-flow is the log of volume discharge. The year, 1984, 85, or 86. Then the sort of a 0, 1, or yes, no. The presence or absence of flood conditions at the time of sampling. Was it a period of very high flow or wasn't it? And then, pertinent for our discussion today, the presence or absence of beaver dams. Yes or no? Did the dams occur or did they not occur? And then finally, sampling location also turned out to be important to consider. This slide illustrates some of the data, and the 4 boxes represent different sampling locations or different groups of sampling locations. All axes on the boxes are similar, so we can immediately make comparisons between and among boxes. The vertical axis, labeled LNAP, is simply the log of this sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus. So the vertical axis is the amount of this biologically available phosphorus. The two horizontal axes represent the concentration of suspended solids, here LSS, but on a log scale. So suspended solids this way, and in this direction, the log of orthophosphate. Each datum point represents data for these three parameters on a particular date, and there's a vertical line which is drawn from the point itself to the bottom of the box to help give your eye some perspective. So my finger's too big. Here, for example, is the datum point, and there's a line then drawn down to indicate where on the bottom of the box that point is located. I show the slide to illustrate simply that with some consideration for a couple of parameters, we can, or the eye itself provides the impression that there are differences among locations. The top left box, for example, are data taken from effluent of the Green River Sewage Treatment Plant. Notice that the lines are always very high. Well, hey, you probably expect that in effluent from a treatment plant. Notice that the top right graph, almost all the points are pretty high. That is, the lines from the points down to the bottom of the box are quite long. And notice also that sort of from left to right along the LSS, or suspended solids, axis, there is, particularly if you consider this as a log scale, there is a tremendous variation. This turns out to be a stream that receives sewage from, or effluent from, Rock Springs, and which is highly erosive. So during periods of higher flow, suspended solids just go off the top. Two boxes at the bottom, the data points look more similar, but you do gain the impression looking at it that at least, perhaps on the right, some of the box on the lower right, some of the values do seem to extend off to the right, perhaps be a little higher than some of the other values. For our purposes today, the point that I wish to make is that a framework, or this framework of statistical analysis of a large group of, or data from a large group of analyses, provides the suggestion, or in fact shows, that concentrations of this NaOHP were affected significantly in the presence of, or absence of beaver dams. The values for NaOHP were less in the presence of these beaver dams than in the absence of the beaver dam. So again, sort of a framework of statistical analysis of a large amount of data. We see that the presence-absence of a beaver dam does have a significant effect on a water quality parameter. The slide lists some of the variables that were important in affecting NaOHP, sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus, and on the lower right we see that, yes, in fact, beaver dams plus minus, that means just presence-absence as an indicator variable, does have, or do have, a significant effect. Well, in summary, I suggest, number one, removal of beaver has been European man's greatest impact on lower order lotic systems. The removal of beaver has been the one thing that, as a group, we've done that's had the greatest effect on lotic systems. Secondly, I suggest you should think of beaver dams as a continually renewed, erosionally resistant substrate. And remember that the beaver provide the energy to do the continual renewing. That's a misstatement, of course, because it's the plants that the beaver eat that provide the energy, and the plants got the energy from the sun, etc. Third, theoretically anyway, we can quantify the ability of a beaver dam to resist erosional perturbations that have been caused by increased discharge. And that the units of this measure, the units in which we will quantify this potential, will be those of volume discharge. And finally, that complexes of beaver ponds or beaver dams can improve the values associated with several important parameters that commonly are used to index water quality. Okay, you can turn off the slides, and I'd be glad to try and answer any questions.
Mike, out of those variables that you listed as being important in predicting sodium hydroxide extractable phosphorus, what level of improvement in your predictive capability came about with dams and so forth?
Owing to dams. If you let's see how to explain this. If you think of a linear regression simply being a straight line, what happens in the presence of the beaver dam is that we get a line either here or a second line parallel but below it, without dams, with dams. The effect was significant. I'd have to look at the paper to see what it was. I must admit I don't remember. Incidentally, I either have what I've talked about has either been published or submitted, so if people are interested, I can provide written materials as well. So it's been a few months. I have to look, Steve. Yeah.
On your graph of Current Creek, you showed that above the dams you had more phosphorus, total phosphorus, and then right at the dam you had less, but then below stream you had, again, the increase. And I would have thought that, and that peak is actually higher than, is that from other tributaries coming in, or where was that phosphorus coming from? How did it increase below the dam?
People have written some about the effect of riparian areas on water quality back east, mostly. One of the things that they have suggested is that the concentration of plants along the riparian zone will intercept and utilize dissolved nutrients in the groundwater as it moves through, pull those out, hold them, and store them. And that so that kind of an effect would be important in what we see in the stream. The streams that we studied were dramatically different. In most places, in the absence of the beaver dams, they were eroding and downcut, so that the water table was perhaps 5 to 15 feet below the surface of the land. The vegetation that was up on top was sagebrush. There's probably not much effect owing to riparian vegetation in that case. In this case, what we're seeing is an increase in particulates, erosive input as a function of discharge, higher discharge. So what you saw there was almost, I don't know, almost, but an excellent correlation between particulates and total phosphorus, between particulates above a threshold of certain velocity. So what you're seeing is input by some downcutting and bank erosion. And what happened is that conditions were bad upstream. They were okay where the beaver dam was, and then they were, again, eroding downstream.
Mike, when you say that beaver dams are erosionally resistant, is there some critical hydrologic event that could break up a beaver dam, or is it more often a case of the internal instability of the dam, wood decaying, that would lead to a blowout?
Yeah, if you think about trying to make a little model, you would probably want to include parameters for two ways the dam complex could fail, or think of it as a dam bank complex. The dam itself could fail, or the dam might do fine, but you have highly erodible soils, you get the dam failing at the edge. So it can happen either way. Did that answer your question?
So there is some threshold hydrologic event where the dams would not be erosionally resistant, there could be
That's right. That would be in the stippled area.
So let me follow up that with another question. I didn't do too well on your true and false quiz because on the first one I would say there are many circumstances where streams are not in equilibrium with their drainage basin, and then streams in the Sierra Madre might fit that model. But so if that's the case, do you think beaver dams would have the same sort of effect on a stream where the greatest sediment transport occurs with a 100-year event as the effects of those same dams in another stream where the 10-year event accounts for the greatest amount of sediment?
Yeah, maybe two comments. I guess I would agree with the geologists that the Earth is getting flatter and flatter, except where it begins to poke up here and there. And, you know, from that scheme of things, probably the beaver aren't going to make a lot of difference. If we look at shorter term scales, I think the answer to your question, is there a difference between, let's see, well, your question was, are they going to have as much an effect if it's the 100-year event as they will if it's the 10-year event? I think the answer to that depends on the situation. If we were to try that perhaps 500 years ago, I think the answer might be different from what it would be as we see systems today.
I'm thinking, you know, in the stream where the 100-year event accounts for the greatest amount of sediment transport, that same event might also cause a blowout of beaver dams in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a stream where the 10-year event accounts for the greatest amount of sediment transport, and a lot of the sediment stored behind those dams because they would not be blown out by that same event.
What do you think? Would 5 to 20 dams on every mile of first to fourth order streams make a difference in the hydrology?
Depends on how flashy a hydrograph would be in that watershed. I think there's differences between the two kinds of streams.
Yeah.
In the effect of being
Yeah. So perhaps you. Yeah. Right.
stable and something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. You want to try?
I'm supposed to press the button. Just one question. You talked about a difference in the regression lines between the presence of beaver ponds and the absence of beaver ponds, which kind of suggests that beaver ponds are a random distribution, that there's no other systematic difference between streams with beaver ponds and streams without beaver ponds.
Would I comment on that? I was constrained by the data that were available, and certainly there were other kinds of differences that did occur. On the other hand, the kinds of changes made sense to me, or the kinds of changes that I observed made sense to me if we consider that some of the contribution to this NaOHP may have been particulate. Then it's easy to see how the dams, or the presence of dams, velocity, turbulence, settling, etc., might lead to that difference. Now, is that a satisfactory answer? Oh, okay.
Okay, Mike, the beavers are having a significant influence on the water quality, and in a sense they're exerting energy or expending energy in order to maintain the stream, to maintain riparian zones, and so on. I suppose those beaver populations fluctuate considerably, though, from time to time. Is that true? Other than through trapping, do we have any information on the importance of diseases or other factors, very harsh winters, shortage of food supplies that might have led to times when indeed a stretch of stream might have been nearly devoid of beavers, and then other times when the beaver population might have been very high, and so what we have then is through maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years there being considerable fluctuation in the water quality simply because the beaver populations are fluctuating. Do we have much information on that?
I think to answer your question, you have to specify it more precisely, and I would ask, are you referring to a particular stretch of a particular stream? Are you referring to a county, a state, a region of the U.S.? And the answer there would be clearly, if we look at a stream on a very small scale, there are changes. I mean, some really good studies been done in this area to show the kind of cyclical changes in occupation, absence, occupation of beaver. When we begin to think about, let's see, I think you're asking that from the point of view, well, in the long run, do beaver really have an effect? And I think the answer there will again depend on scale.
Well, I don't doubt that they have an effect, but I'm just wondering how that effect changes through time, say like on a 5 or 10 mile stretch of stream.
On a 5 or 10 mile stretch of stream, the data from around here suggests that we've got, let's say we start it with no beaver present, food, aspen begin to grow, beaver somehow migrate in, rediscover the area, eat themselves out of house and home. They leave because there's no food, the trees grow back. So yes, you do get a cycle.
Okay, so those kinds of cycles are pretty well documented then.
At least in some places, yeah.
Yeah, I see. That's what I was really wondering. Yeah. So they might move down to the next lower reach for a while, and then, like you say, rediscover in other areas.
Apparently there was a beaver that discovered some sort of holding pond near a drilling rig in the Red Desert. And nobody had any idea where this hummer came from, but there he was. Interestingly, some of the work that's been done with, and I can't point you to a reference, but a colleague has mentioned that a colleague of his who is interested in landscape analysis found, looking at some area in the east, that the most important attribute of a riparian area in terms of making a major difference in how it, what a landscape ecology, and it's a number that you would associate it with it, was the presence or absence of beaver. Some of the work that's been done in northern Minnesota shows that in the distribution of trees, you can see areas where beaver ponds were for decades, simply because of the effect on the hydrology and so on. So I guess maybe I've answered your question. I should stop. Yeah.
More of a policy question. You mentioned a group in Idaho that was looking at reintroduction. Is there anything going on in Wyoming? Any suggestions coming from groups thinking about this sort of thing?
I think the work that Quent's doing, Skinner is artificial beaver dams in a way. So there's that. I think there has been some work by some people in the Bureau of Reclamation that have been interested in beaver as a tool. I'm not sure if there are any private individuals thinking about it or not. Gets a little, it sounds really good. like a deal that's too good to be true. If what we wish to do is to control erosion, let's get a couple of beaver, put them in, and we've got it licked. In fact, I had a friend who was working for BLM, and he was joking one day that he got a phone call from like the Philippines, or someplace like that in Asia, wanting to know if he could send him a beaver because they had this erosion problem and he wanted to fix it up. Think about it about beaver as a tool. No matter what tool you use, there will always be expenses. There will always be pros and cons. So it's not a panacea. And I don't know of any areas in Wyoming actively.
Would you be willing to speculate on any negative aspects of the effects of beaver on water quality?
Sure. One that's been of concern in Colorado is Giardia. Beaver in areas where drinking water is from the surface, recreational areas in the mountains, have had some problems. I understand there's some areas in Canada that have extirpated beaver from portions of the drainage being used for drinking water.
What about effects on things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, and substrate quality in streams?
If you're asking me to judge better or worse, I have to have some way to decide, some framework for deciding better or worse. In general, fisheries biologists looking at effect of beaver in eastern areas have not found beaver to be all that positive. In western areas, particularly where temperature may not be quite so much problem, are different. Some studies in the state of Washington have shown that in terms of fisheries, the presence of beaver provides, in some cases, habitat which is the only place where some of the young fish are able to survive. So, does that answer your question?
Any other questions for Mike?
Yeah, you indicated that the introduction of beaver is not a panacea, and I agree with that. One of the problems that I've read recently about is in California they're having a little bit of a problem. They introduced beaver in the late 30s to reduce problems with floods up in the foothills behind the Los Angeles area. And I believe now what they've discovered is that the beaver non-indigenous to that area are destroying an indigenous tree species. So what do you say about something like that?
I must admit I don't know about the details of that particular area. My understanding is that beaver was ubiquitous throughout North America. That may be a problem, but in a sense that's probably a difficulty caused by man himself. Because my guess is that what you have are some isolated areas of vegetation, and the beaver are going in and eating those. Quite likely, if man had not intervened and perhaps destroyed many other of those patches, if we looked at that system on a large scale, what we would see would be at any one point in any one time, the beaver may be eating up the trees in one particular spot, but they're growing somewhere else. But given what you say is true, then one has to make some kind of qualitative decision about what is best. Develop a framework for making a decision, and then make your decision.
The only reason that I brought that up is that there always is a cause in California, and presently that was one of the causes when I was out there this summer. And the debate was between two environmental groups. One was leave the beaver where they are, and the other were take them out because we want to keep the trees where the trees are. So I was just, trying to find out what your feeling on that was. Thank you.
What you see is the two groups having different criteria by which to make a judgment.